Let's give Josh a great welcome from Notre Dame.
Thanks so much for that generous introduction, and delighted to be here. I was joking earlier that I wasn't sure if I'd been in Indiana before, and then I realized I was born in Indiana, so I must have been here at some point in my life. And my wife taught here on faculty as an adjunct when she was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, so has many kind things to say about this place. And you have proud football traditions, as we do at the University of Texas, so delighted to be here. I'm going to talk about this working paper called Structural Climate Realism, the Geopolitical Importance of Climate Change and the Clean Energy Transition. And let's see if I can get the clicker to work, maybe. Let me try something. Oop. All right, let's see if that works. We'll make the warning go away. So what I want to do in my time is give you a bit of motivation for the project, talk about the argument, and then talk about two specific aspects: climate impacts and international relations, and a second one about climate responses and geopolitics. So in terms of the motivation for the project, again, not sure what's happening. Might need a little help here. I could just wildly gesticulate when it's time. All right. So in terms of the motivation for the project, a number of scholars have acknowledged that environmental problems get inadequate coverage in international relations journals. And in my mind, that itself is a challenge, because environmental problems, including climate change, but not limited to climate change, are some of the biggest challenges we face on the planet. And yet, when we train graduate students, when we trained undergraduate students, when I was in graduate school, there was nary a course on global environmental governance. There wasn't a course on environmental security. And so I had to invent them, but I also had to teach myself, right? Because there wasn't any ground literature to speak of, or coursework. I mean, there were things that I could read, but they weren't in the core discipline. And so I wanted to write a piece that would be maybe assigned in graduate classes, in your standard either graduate classes or undergraduate classes, on why this set of problems is so important and worthy of being included, not in a separate environmental class, but in like a mainstream international relations class or international security class. So, okay, no, it worked that time. We can go back, I got it. All right, so this paper also builds upon my 2022 book called States and Nature: The Effects of Climate Change on Security. So for about the past 20 years, I've been thinking about, how do climate impacts affect security? What do we mean by security? How do we trace that through? And so I did a 2022 book on this topic that was the sort of coming together of all of the insights that I'd developed over that 20-year period, thinking about how do climate impacts affect security. But beyond that, more recently, I've been writing about the clean energy transition, industrial policy, and critical minerals. And here, most of the emphasis is on thinking about how responses to climate change and the movement to clean energy themselves might become sort of strategically important in geopolitics, in international relations. And so I wanted to write a piece that spoke to both of those two sides of my research interest, because often scholars either write about the first one but don't write about the second one, or they write about them separately and never bring them together in a single article or paper. So that was part of the motivation for writing this piece. A third is, as you heard, I spent time in the government from 2021 to 2023 as a senior climate advisor at the U.S. Department of Defense. And one of my responsibilities was to think about how should we integrate climate change into the national defense strategy. So if you do a word search in there and you find the word climate, I might have had something to do with that. But this kind of follows on in thinking about, in a very practical and pragmatic way, under what circumstances does climate change affect either U.S. national security interests broadly or the specific interests of the Department of Defense. So this sort of follows in that tradition. I've tried to experiment with bringing these two ideas together for public audiences. So if you're interested, I have like a 10-minute TEDx talk that I did recently that is maybe more accessible than some of the ideas in the paper, which may be pitched at more kind of international relations theory, but I'm trying different ways to get the ideas out that climate change is really important and it's not going anywhere and we need to deal with it. And so I'll come back to that in my conclusion. So in terms of the argument, the basic premise builds on a classic work in international relations theory that for some of you may have come across it in your studies. For any international relations scholars in the room, it's old hat, but for those who haven't read about it, there's a book that I guess may precede some of your time if you were born after the 1980s, right? In the late 1970s, Kenneth Waltz has this book come out called Theory of International Politics. And for those of us who came of age as scholars in the 1990s, this is something that you read a lot about, and it was introduced the idea that anarchy is a structural feature in the international system. Now, anarchy has a casual meaning that's sort of lawlessness and disorder. But that's not how he meant it. What he meant is that there's a lack of a centralized authority in the international system. There's no overarching world government. And in the absence of that, states have to take care of themselves and practice what he called self-help. And they, at the very least, they had to take care of their own needs for survival. If nothing else, if you can't survive as a state in the international system, you can't pursue any other goals. But he also noted that states had unequal capabilities in their ability to do that. And the sort of collective outcome of every state acting on this notion of practicing self-help, he calls this coaction of like units, of every state trying to survive, kind of sets the international system up for potential conflict as states are vying to take care of themselves that may have unsalutary effects on the security of other states in the international system. He doesn't necessarily predict that all states will necessarily heed the systemic incentives that they face. Some states may deviate from that, but they will face punishment if they do. If you don't take care of yourself, no one else will, and you might cease to exist as an independent unit in the international system. State death could therefore proceed. You could be conquered and taken over by another country, and that would be the end of it, right? So I was inspired by that, and I developed some of these ideas in my 2022 book to think about climate change. To me, seems like a powerful force that is shaping the behavior of states in the international system in the way that we've come to recognize that anarchy does. And so I liken it to a structural parameter that alters, that all states have to respond to, but their capability of responding to that problem is unequally distributed, right? All states have to respond to the problem of worsening climate conditions, but they're not all equally affected by this problem, and they're not all equally capable of dealing with this problem. And so when we think about what climate change is doing, we're talking about increased pollution that is a consequence of human activity, of burning fossil fuels. And what that's done is changed what scientists call stationarity. There's always been variability in climatic systems, right? But human civilization evolved in a sort of narrow bound of variability. And what climate change does is altering the extremes that we're facing, and we're in a world in which all of us are going to be facing these worsening climate conditions. And so it's not anything that any of us intentionally tried to bring about. It's like the coaction of like units, we are all bound by this problem of worsening climate change, absent our agency to change it. We're all going to be bound by this problem forevermore, and it is this unintended byproduct of individual choices by us at the personal level and at the level of the nation state. And so the argument that follows from this is that climate impacts will have implications for international relations, and I'll make a more specific point on that, and that the responses to climate change will have geopolitical implications. Those are the two central insights that come out of this, and then I'll try and make a more specific set of observations about that. That all else equal, the countries that are best prepared to deal with climate impacts are likely to fare better economically and geopolitically than other states. That speaks to the first premise about the geopolitical implications of climate impacts. And the second is that countries that decarbonize more fully will be better positioned to profit from the clean energy transition economically and strategically. And so that deals with the second part, that that countries that do the most, both to prepare for climate impacts and to move to decarbonize, are ultimately going to be more successful in the international system. And so the argument emphasizes that all states have structural incentives to adapt to climate change, and they also have structural incentives to decarbonize and mitigate their climate change. But mitigate is a very specific word, which means reducing emissions, either by taking them out of the atmosphere, as we'll talk about, through processes called geoengineering, or reducing their emissions by changing the nature of their economies. So I'll say more about both of those things in a second. So I think I'm going backwards. Let me go forwards. I'm going backwards again. Let me go forwards. Right. Okay. So climate impacts in international relations. So in the paper, what I talk about is, and this may be hard to read at a distance because it could be small, but there are a variety of things that I identify as effects of climate change that are important implications for international relations of climate impacts. The first is state death, and I'll say more about that in a second. The second is changing state borders. The third is a variety of things that are related to the negative spillover consequences across borders of climate impacts, which include the potential for conflict. It also includes humanitarian emergencies. It also includes migration. And then the last aspect I talk a bit about is the impacts on military bases and capabilities. Okay, so what do we mean by state death? Well, nation states have become the preferred political form on the planet. There are polities that are not yet states, like Palestine, that would aspire to be so. There are others that would like to secede from their nation states, Somaliland, Puntland, potentially. Being a state has become an arbiter on some level of success in the international system. It is the dominant state form. States have been created in the era of decolonization, but states hardly ever these days disappear. But we may be in a moment with climate change of low-lying island countries in particular, like Kiribati, which is pictured here, an atoll nation in the Pacific that doesn't have that many people, but nonetheless may find itself in time facing the existential threat of climate change. And that may be sooner rather than later in this century, because even if sea level rise only gradually comes to overtop that country, it may become uninhabitable well before then, due to the combination of modest sea level rise along with storm surge, so that their water supply becomes salinated, and they won't have enough access to potable water for drinking or for food growing. These are small populations, but where will these folks go? And the other aspect of this is that, and this sort of feeds into one of my later points, is that their exclusive economic zones over which they have sovereignty will change as a consequence of it, and there may be contestation over these countries and the economic resources that they once controlled. Who will control them if they cease to exist as independent countries in the international system? Let's see, stuck again. Let's see, might need help. There we go. As I suggested, that climate impacts are potentially remaking maps of the world. It's most obvious in the Arctic, where melting summer sea ice is leading to new transit routes that are themselves opening up areas for tourism, but also access to hydrocarbons or minerals. It may be changing who has territorial claims over those landforms nearby, and it potentially becomes new theaters for surveillance and possibly attack, although we can overstate that potentially. And so this is another important implication of climate change. It's not limited to the Arctic. As I mentioned, the changes in the Pacific, where countries are gradually becoming submerged or losing landform as a result of climate impacts, their borders are also changing as a consequence of climate impacts. But the Arctic one is one that has captured a lot of attention. Okay, so a third consequence of climate change that is often talked about is the potential for conflict. And I've been part of this literature for, as I said, about 20 years, and most of the findings have been mixed or inconclusive about how important a driver of mostly internal conflict within countries climate is. It's limited to a specific set of circumstances. Thus far, it's mostly agriculturally dependent countries that have low state capacity, that maybe have highly exclusive political systems that reward some groups at the expense of others. That, and in my book, I talk about those two dimensions alongside the absence or the delivery of foreign aid in biased manners. But the upshot of these arguments is that heretofore, climate has been seen as a relatively small driver of civil wars and communal conflicts in countries. But the literature, like the piece that I flagged here from Catherine Mock and others, suggests that in a world of increasing climate change, which we're facing, the signal of climate as a contributor to conflict is likely to grow in the future. By how much, we don't know. And there's also human agency through diplomacy and other things that can diminish those risks. But nonetheless, that's something else that we increasingly have to worry about in a climate-constrained world. Okay, the next aspect is much of this literature has focused on, does climate change cause conflict? And that's somewhat unsatisfying to folks like me who acknowledge that other kinds of problems can rise to the level of security concerns, of being both nationally and geopolitically important, short of causing armed conflict between actors. And here, humanitarian emergencies loom large, both as large problems for individual countries and possibly problems that have spillover effects across borders. And increasingly, we're seeing demands on the military for defense support of civilian authorities. So in my time at the Pentagon, for example, we noted that the U.S. has had to dedicate more resources from the National Guard to fight wildfires, and that amount of personnel days increased dramatically in just a handful of years, and we've seen it most recently in the mobilization after the wildfires that affected California. And that diversion of security professionals from their training and preparations for other tasks maybe takes them away from being ready and available for warfighting. But we also can think of the human security consequences of these large-scale emergencies as in being important in their own right. And we see the return of mass famine emerging in places around the world, that is substantively important whether or not militaries are mobilized to address that particular problem. So we're seeing it in Sudan, Somalia, and other places. And obviously that often intersects with other drivers of those food disruptions. It's not simply something that's climate driven. It often intersects with ongoing violence. But nonetheless, humanitarian emergencies that have a climate component to them are increasingly important on the global stage and will be so going forward. Another aspect of these humanitarian emergencies that makes them more than just very important problems that might have some security dimensions to them is if you end up with temporary or sustained losses of monopoly of force, that you have sustained lawlessness after these humanitarian emergencies that could metastasize into something more significant in terms of rebellion and conflict. So there may be a conflict relation to this in places, if not immediately, over time, if it leads to lower economic growth in those societies. The last aspect that I'll talk about is legitimation crises. We know in authoritarian regimes that failure to respond to large-scale humanitarian emergencies can potentially lead to crises of confidence in the regime and potential regime turnover. Okay, so that's another dimension of climate impacts that I wanted to talk about. Another sort of important climate-related implication for international relations is the increased risk of migration. Most movements that are climate-related are internal, they're temporary. You know, there's a storm or flood, people move to the nearby town, and then they come back when it's over. But, and it's certainly a legitimate coping mechanism that communities have in the short run or even the long run, facing deteriorating conditions for agriculture and or just emergency situations that emerge from swift onset disasters. But under certain circumstances, those movements of people, particularly ones across borders, but also within countries, can lead to potential conflict in societies. If not violent conflict, it can be contestation over services and access to resources between communities. And much of that violence that may ensue is contingent upon how host communities receive them. It's not so much about the migrants themselves. And so some of these mechanisms and examples, so do we have cases of this in my book? I talk about the Syrian civil war and how a drought precipitated large-scale movements of people inside Syria, and try to carefully assess the degree to which that might have had a role in the onset of that civil war. Outside of the conflict space, the transnational movement of migrants that has a climate component can be politicized by recipient countries. And so I did a paper with colleagues that cited, or this is a screenshot of it here, came out in a Nature-affiliated journal, about how hotter and drier than normal conditions in the 2010s in Central America is associated with more outmigration to the United States, even taking into account other risk factors like local violence. And so the coping mechanisms of transborder migration from Central America in and of itself aren't security problems. How the United States receive them has securitized that problem in ways that have magnified, and we're on some level still dealing with those consequences today. The last is that those island countries that I mentioned earlier that may be facing this existential risk, there are already pressures and movements of people out of those countries. So it's another way in climate change has profound consequences for the international system. One of the most important ways that folks at the Department of Defense have been worried about climate impacts, and this is true for other militaries, is about the particular impacts on their own facilities. So the U.S. Department of Defense has had to spend tens of billions of dollars in recent years in addressing disrupted infrastructure at military bases, from Offutt Air Force Base to Camp Lejeune to a number of others. And there are concerns beyond just damage to military bases, but how climate is altering military capabilities, the ability to fly, other capabilities like sonar equipment, their ability to train on so-called black flag days. It's just too hot to train soldiers. And that all of these increased impacts on the military pose significant opportunity costs of climate-proofing infrastructure and practices. So that's a more prosaic, localized one, but that's one that militaries around the world are increasingly grappling with. Okay. Most of the literature on the security impacts of climate change have focused on countries in the global south, poor developing countries. But as I argue in the paper, that these impacts aren't limited to those sets of countries. Both the great powers, the U.S. and China in particular, but others as well, are themselves vulnerable to these impacts, in part because they have a lot of expensive infrastructure along coasts. And both of them are sufficiently rich to prepare for those consequences that could be multi-billion dollars in their impacts, but they may be differentially poised to try to anticipate and make their societies more resilient. And over time, as I pose the question, is China going to be better positioned to deal with these climate impacts? And that could lead to, even if the U.S. presently has certain military capabilities advantages vis-a-vis China, those may be diminish over time if the U.S. fails to get its own house in order in protecting itself and practicing what Waltz said was so important under anarchy, which is practicing self-help and taking care of its own needs for survival. Climate impacts, as we've seen with Helene and the fires of late, and any number of other major climate-related disasters in recent years, have cost hundreds of billions of dollars to recover from, and that comes at a cost. Okay, so I want to turn, and I'm going to be a little briefer in the next bit, is thinking about the geopolitical implications of responses to climate change. But there are a number of them that I want to go through in brief. That in the paper I talk about the challenges of global governance. All of these are thinking about how to mitigate and reduce emissions and how to deal with the transition away from fossil fuels. And so the challenges of global governance are some. The other is the backdraft potential of responses to climate change, and I'll unpack that in a second. And then the third is about distributional battles within countries over the transition to clean energy, and then the distributional battle and contestation between countries over the transition to clean energy. And the last is how the intersection of the clean energy transition with power transition. So if you followed anything about debates about climate mitigation and the global management of climate change, you may be familiar with like the 2015 Paris Agreement, in which countries made, it was a treaty, but countries under that treaty arrangement made voluntary commitments to reduce their emissions by different amounts depending on what they thought they could do. And the classic conception in international relations about how to deal with this problem is one of public goods, in which all countries have to do something, but it's difficult to sort of coordinate and get countries to agree on what they should do. And the upshot is often, for particular public goods problems, is one of collective under-provision, of maybe over-promising and insufficient delivery. But we've actually seen that in the case of global climate governance. And so the Paris Agreement, despite the optimism that was associated with it in 2015, has faced a number of geopolitical sort of setbacks. The first of them being the first Trump administration, which took the U.S. temporarily out of the Paris Agreement, but other setbacks have ensued with diversion of attention to COVID, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There are other sort of big geopolitical setbacks, but the kind of central insight that we come out of this, we come back to some of the observations from realist thought that treaties in the international arena are not self-enforcing, and there's difficulties, given that there's no overarching world government, to punish states for failure to abide by their commitments. And so we're in a world in which there are strong incentives for countries individually and collectively to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. That's a central driver of behavior in the international system these days, but we're not getting sufficient action to ultimately realize what's required to protect ourselves collectively. So that's one aspect of the geopolitical implications of efforts to deal with the climate problem that I talk about in the paper. The second one is how countries are incentivized to try to think about other ways of meeting their needs for either new energy resources, to support the clean energy transition, or to reduce emissions in other ways, or to meet their needs for, say, arable land or foodstuffs. And so we see the potential for increased contestation, and even violent contestation, what Jeff DeBelko and colleagues at the Wilson Center called the backdraft potential of responses to climate change, which included new contestation over access to critical minerals for the minerals that are needed for battery technology as part of the clean energy transition. They're also worried about land grabs where countries may not be able to grow enough food at home, so they're pursuing arable land in other countries. And the last is unilateral efforts by countries to geoengineer the atmosphere to make their local climate system more tolerable for them. And that could be through solar radiation management, where they're putting sort of mirrors in space, or they're injecting air pollution into the atmosphere. All of these things have the great potential because they're under governed in the international system. There are few rules related to them, that they have the tremendous potential for contestation and potential conflict if there's unilateral deployment of things like geoengineering. So I spend a little bit more time in the paper on that. The last couple of things I want to talk about, and then I want to open it up for questions, is the argument used to be that the challenges we face in the international system of mitigating, that is, reducing emissions from climate change and getting enough actors to make commitments, has to do with these problems of free riding. That if, for public goods problems, you have the challenges of some countries will commit to take action, but other countries will wait until others sort of pay the cost, and then they could reap the benefits without contributing. And there's emergent literature from a number of folks in this space who say that's not the core problem of climate change. The core problem of dealing with the emissions of greenhouse gases isn't about free riding behavior. It's really about distributional conflicts between actors inside countries over the incumbent fossil fuel dependent asset holders or companies, and those who are affected by the pollution from climate change, right? Those communities that are most affected by climate impacts, they're relatively less powerful than those incumbent interests who depend upon profits from fossil fuels, and so they're having trouble. The reason why things may shift is if you have new interests emerge in clean technologies that, together along with those affected actors, band together, they may have enough political power to shift the balance. And so really what's the question that we have to ask ourselves as we think about the implications globally is, under what conditions can the balance shift to these clean energy and vulnerable interests to have more political power inside countries and collectively on the international stage. So that's where the action is emerging in the literature, and these aren't simply sort of prosaic questions for environmentalists. These are providing profound questions for international political economy at a time when governments are increasingly thinking that you can't get the necessary emissions reductions to protect ourselves from dangerous climate change without intentional efforts by states to invest in industrial policy and move countries faster away from fossil fuels. And so that distributional tension between actors inside countries is also mirrored internationally between countries. And we're at an interesting moment in time in which China is now the dominant actor with respect to the production of these technologies. And they actually produce enough of these technologies to meet their own needs. And they're by far the biggest deployer of solar, wind, and battery technologies and electric vehicles on the planet. But they're also sufficiently capable of manufacturing enough to meet their own needs and a significant fraction of the rest of the world's needs, which sounds great, right? It means there's cheap, clean technology for other countries around the world that want to leapfrog and move beyond the fossil fuel interest or want to move beyond internal combustion engine, but it potentially poses a risk for other countries that want to maintain their own independent manufacturing capability like the US. And so we're increasingly seeing the securitization of trade and trade measures where the entire trading regime is becoming under strain as not simply related to climate and clean energy, but that's at the heart of some of the disputes between the US and Europe and China over, say, electric vehicles and renewables technologies. Okay, so last points I want to make is to reiterate the central argument that all states have incentive to adapt to climate change to survive. They also have structural incentives from the international system to decarbonize. And there are two other structural factors in the international system that intersect with climate change. One is anarchy, in that there's no overarching world government that can force them to do any of those things, particularly on the mitigation side of reducing emissions. The other is interdependence, though, that no country is able to resolve these issues sufficiently on their own. So on some level, they have incentives from that countervailing structural, attribute of interdependence to want to work with other countries to try to protect their own interests. But we're living in it, so which of these factors ultimately dominates depends upon human agency and sort of contingent set of other factors like who's in charge in different political systems at the moment. I would say that the sort of zeitgeist of the moment, the sort of international temperature is what we call in international relations terms a high preoccupation with relative gains, a high preoccupation with not what are the absolute benefits for everybody in the world, but what's in it for me in my country. And that bodes ill for progress on this twin set of issues, both adaptation to climate impacts and mitigation and reducing emissions. But just because the pressures of the moment are not favorable for action doesn't mean we can wish them to go away. We may not care about climate change in this country, but climate change cares about us, and it's an unavoidable fact of life, a structural parameter that we'll all face.
Okay, we've got one, but you're on the list for sure, okay? Just give you my absolute word of honor. Yeah, there you go.
I have a question about agroterrorism. I'm not sure how much your research has gone into that, but with the U.S. being especially vulnerable to agroterrorism, being such a restricted culture of corn and soybeans, I guess how vulnerable are they to climate change, especially looking at the agroterrorism threat?
You said agroterrorism?
Yeah.
Like that there would be intentional efforts by malevolent actors to sabotage American agriculture?
Yeah, like introducing different pests or diseases and how
Yeah.
climate change has affected that, whether helping it spread or limiting it.
I haven't, I mean, that's certainly a possibility, but like we could be concerned about lots of different things in the world, and I haven't heard anything credible or that's sort of news to me if there are actors that have any capability of doing that. You periodically hear that in the global health space, that you're worried about, intentional efforts, but that might be an interesting area for academic study, but what we hear more about is cyber risks associated with internet connected technologies like electric vehicles. And that has emerged as something that the US government has gotten worked up about and passed rules to limit, say, Chinese systems in the country. That has its sort of parallels of infection, but it's of a cyber nature, not of a natural, like pest nature. And even those, I think, are overwrought, and the US has overcorrected on responding to that particular challenge. Yeah.
Great. Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, well, I mean, you touched on it very briefly, but you said that the debate is not about, or should not be about, free riders,
Yeah.
but like, I still like, well, I don't know. I wanted to hear what you think about like backpassing and that as a driver for international conflict. That is climate change as a structural, element of the international system. Thus, as a factor, backpassing as a strategy that would, make international conflict more likely.
Yeah, so there's an element of the paper that I might want to develop if it survives the review process and I get another opportunity to revise it, which has to do with how countries respond to the absence of action, particularly by leading countries. For example, will other countries blame the U.S. for its departure from the global stage of leaving the Paris Agreement again? What are the sort of reputational consequences of that? Do those rise to the level of any importance for U.S. strategic interests? That's sort of related to your question. I would say that and it's not quite clear that there will be particular punishment that other countries are even in a position to impose on the U.S. for that. It just might be a kind of gradual diminution in other countries' confidence in the U.S. as contributor to global public goods or global action on any kind. Whether or not that matters to the U.S. in the long run, it's uncertain. I think the way I would phrase it is not that the concerns about buckpassing or free riding go away. They've just been overtaken in the literature in international relations with this new set of arguments. Some people take it too far and say that's the only driver. I think it's another driver that has been understudied and underemphasized and may be as, if not more important in limiting the ability inside countries to respond. But you still have this dynamic between countries that countries are waiting for others to take action. And so it's not like their choices on some level are still interdependent. So if countries look like they're doing more, other countries may feel like they need to do more. And we're sort of in a moment in which, because of the US, but not only because of the US, lots of other countries feel like they can take a free pass and not do very much because the US has decided to take its toys and go home.
Thank you so much for your talk. I don't know that much about clean energy, but I am wondering how you weigh the security risks of perhaps moving to clean energy in the first place, like that it's super costly or that it's perhaps more unreliable,
right,
versus the security risks of not switching.
Yeah, so I think the cheapest sources of energy now are solar and wind, right? The challenge though is that they're intermittent. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, so the net costs of the system are a little higher when you add in like battery storage, or if you have other sources of backup power like, you have a coal plant but you don't run it all the time, or you have a natural gas plant and you don't run it all the time and you turn it on when you need it. But if you were trying to build like a new source of electricity to meet consumer demand, or increasingly for like AI, your first impulse as a market actor in this country, and actually in most countries around the world, would be like, let's throw some renewables on there because we can get them on there in a hurry. There are like 5-year lag times to get like turbines for natural gas plants. The challenge though is, there's some system operation costs to deal with intermittent power. So it's a more complex enterprise to have renewables on the grid. So I would say that there's sort of a myth that that renewables are more expensive than traditional fossil fuel resources, and so from that perspective, there are energy security issues that have to be managed in a more complex management system, but that's where the future's headed all over the world. And if the U.S. decides not to move in that direction, it's going to face, there are already estimates from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that we're going to have blackouts because of AI data centers hogging our existing source of energy demand, and we won't be able to build either nuclear plants fast enough or coal-burning power plants fast enough or natural gas turbines, and that would be worse than where the market was leading us in recent years, which is just to get more solar farms and wind farms and battery storage on the grid as quickly as we can.
Great. Okay, next is Harrison.
free riding problem, because in the literature you're saying that the concern now is mostly about this firm level problem where firms you're having these domestic battles with firms that are benefited by not addressing climate change versus climate change. So I'm curious how exactly that is differentiated from the free rider problem, particularly in it's the government's choice at that point to not face the domestic costs for trying to push back against these firms, even though they recognize the challenge of the climate change. They're making a trade-off saying, we don't actually want to address that. We value keeping these firms happy / not addressing those costs. So first is how you differentiate that, or more so how the literature differentiates that. And then second, you say that we're living through a period of high relative gains in Greco, you say Greco.
Yeah.
I'm curious, a lot of structural realists would say that relative gains problems are always persistent. So, or at the very least, can always get away with it, or get away from it. So, I guess, what is the environment under which relative gains, at least to the point where you see serious cooperation among great powers to try to solve climate change, particularly in a way where they're willing to not risk saying, hey, I might be okay with climate change, or it might be bad, but I might come out better.
Right.
What's the threshold do you think we have to go past for that to actually become an actionable item?
Right. So in terms of your first question, how is the distributional sort of dimension of this different from free riding? I think it's basically stopping seeing the state as a unitary actor. So it's not the state deciding that we're going to buck pass or free ride. It's the sort of contestation of interest groups in their society, and the net effect might be the same, right? They end up free riding or buck passing, but the reason why they do so isn't because of an intentional effort by the state to say we don't want to do more. It's because the balance of interest in their society means they don't end up doing more, right? So if you come at it from that perspective, you realize that you don't solve the issue of performance of countries through browbeating them. It's the mechanism of change is got to be one where the sort of forces in favor of action internally have more political power, right? So I think the diagnosis and prescription are different if you think that the distributional logic is what's driving behavior, not the sort of intentional efforts by states responding to promises from other states, right? They might not be responding at all to promises from other states. It's just they have their own internal logic to them. In terms of your second question, I think Greco in his piece about relative gains says they're always present, but it's sort of a variable in that the importance that individual countries or collectively that changes over time depending on the context. And like it's like K, right? It's a variable in this equation. You probably may be familiar with it. But we're living in what I would call a high K moment, but that doesn't mean much to anybody in the room unless you read his article, which has it as like a variable in this equation. But the upshot is we're living in a moment in which many states in the international system are placing a higher priority on what are the gains of action of any policy for them. The sort of absolute gains of welfare improvement for anybody else in the international system be damned. They don't care about it. It's just what it's in it for me. And I think you ask a valid question. Like, under what conditions does the concern about relative gains diminish when you have sort of rising powers and falling powers? Are those always inevitably going to be high relative gain concerns moments because the stakes are fraught? Like, China overtaking the U.S. might mean great power war. So can we diminish those sets of concerns, or are we just going to be in that world? And I think that's the central problem we're facing. So I'm part of this Penn project on the future of U.S. China relations, and I think there's a real debate that's opened up now, even in the Trump administration, perhaps more so than the Biden administration, in that in the Biden administration, both the Republicans and Democrats were out competing each other to be the most anti-China. And Trump actually doesn't really care about China's rise in the same way. All he cares about is like a good deal for the U.S. And so he might, trade Taiwan or whatever if he saw it possible to get a better deal. And what that means is you have actors like we met with the embassy staff in Beijing this summer when I was there, and they're saying like, neither the United States or China are going anywhere. We have to figure out some way of living with each other, because the alternative of dying in a great power war would lead to unimaginable consequences. And so, does the agency of actors intentionally recognizing that potentially lead to a moment in which we think we're better off figuring out how to work together, and maybe that diminishes the parameter of concern about relative gains? It's hard to see it given the politics of the moment in the country. I'm not optimistic, but I'd rather not die in a great power war. So, yeah.
Ian.
Thanks for a very interesting paper. I'm curious, when you talk about negotiating global frameworks here and lack of enforcement, this brings to mind some of the literature on competitive arms control. And in the interwar period, you see a number of cases where you negotiate arms control arrangements. The states most concerned about an arms race follow them, and other states do not. And I'm curious how agreements like Paris, Tokyo, how some states might use them to disproportionately improve their strategic position. So China, right now, is a dominant manufacturing power. I think they produce roughly a third of the global carbon emissions. They're quite happy to have the Europeans decarbonize and become dependent on their energy, manufacturing exports. Does that, is it disproportionately benefiting China, in other words, and harming security elsewhere? So I'm just curious about when we talk about relative gains, do you see that certain states thinking in those terms when you look at the actual text of these agreements in place?
Yeah, I think you can get a little hung up on textual analysis of the particular agreements. I mean, the lawyers do that, and God bless them. But I think on some level, we have to judge them by behavior aside from the text. And a lot of these things are like, so China made so the Paris Agreement basically breaks precedent from previous approaches to climate, where diplomats sat around a table and said, how much are you going to reduce your emissions by, right? That didn't work under Kyoto, which I talk a little bit about in the paper. The Paris Agreement broke new ground where countries came up with their nationally determined contributions, with pledges that they thought they were prepared to do, right? And they're supposed to be updated every 5 years. Now is the 5th year. They're supposed to have been updated in February of this year. Most countries missed the boat. But if you read the recent news, President Xi, I think, did a video at the UN Security Gathering of General Assembly that said, hey, we're going to peak our emissions, and we're going to get them by 2030 to be like 7 to 10% below the peak by 2035. I'm forgetting the date, but so states are going to do what they're going to do, and she's made a calculation that this is something that China can meet, even though their emissions haven't peaked yet, and they're now responsible for more than 30% of global emissions. They only surpassed the U.S. as the lead polluter in 2006, and they've just gone up and up and up and up. So the way I think about this is, there are texts in these agreements, but states are going to do what's in their interest. But the way they're calculating their interest is a mixed portrait, because they're thinking we're vulnerable to these climate impacts, but we're also now the net producer of many of these clean technologies. Our future is increasingly bound up in what they call ecological civilization. Now, maybe they're just saying that as bullshitters, and that doesn't actually mean behavioral change. But when I was there this summer, and when I was there last year in Shanghai meeting with industry leaders, I get the sense that they actually believe that the future is in clean energy, and they're well poised to benefit from it. And they're going to do things to try and maximize their relative advantage. But in the process, they're also going to do things that are of benefit to others potentially. And they do feel themselves sort of reputationally bound to try to improve their own performance, because, and this kind of gets at the question that was posed earlier about, will other states punish them on some level or act against them if they do not enough on climate and are seen as the sort of climate villains of the century, and that they compromise the ability of other people to survive on the planet. And so that's perhaps not enough in the paper right now, and I may want to integrate it, but I think that's part of the overall calculus that the Chinese are making at the moment.
Gentleman in the back.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you for giving the talk. And then my main question is, given that energy security is one of the most important things that a state needs in ensuring its own national security, with the transition that seems necessary given the threat of climate change to renewable energy, what ways in which do you see states changing how they secure their energy interests as they move away from fossil fuels, and what regions might become more important in that calculation? Because historically we've seen emphasis placed on areas like the Middle East, the Caucasus, Venezuela, areas that are very rich in fossil fuels and oil specifically. Do you see priorities shifting among countries, and if so, do you have any thoughts on how that might occur?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the challenges is that so we're moving to a world in which batteries are becoming more like semiconductors, sort of ubiquitous ingredients in lots of different applications, both civilian and military. But the fundamental, so that changes where you get the minerals that go into the batteries become increasingly important. But then battery chemistries are also changing. And so, the dominant battery chemistry, if you had an electric vehicle a few years ago, was nickel, manganese, cobalt. So where do you get nickel from? Mostly Indonesia. Where do you get cobalt from? Mostly Democratic Republic of Congo. Manganese more widely distributed. Except none of those countries really process, Indonesia to a certain extent, none of those countries really process those minerals there. Everything gets shipped to China, right? And then and lithium is also part of the mix of those lithium-ion lithium batteries as well. Lithium is produced in Australia, in the Americas, Chile, Bolivia, but it's all mostly shipped to China and then processed there. And so as we think about, if we were to say, oh, well, we're going to need a lot of cobalt, so let's change our strategic orientation to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which the Trump administration is kind of doing, except that the battery chemistry changed, right? And now the dominant battery chemistry of newer electric vehicle batteries is lithium iron phosphate battery, which requires no nickel and no cobalt, right? Now you still might need, and the differential is that not only do you not have to source minerals from sort of volatile countries, the lithium iron phosphate battery is 30 to 40% cheaper, and it has less risk of an energy ramp and catching on fire, right? So it's thought to be safer, but it's also less energy dense. And so it means if you care about range, range anxiety is a real thing. I have an electric vehicle, and when you get down to less than 10, you start freaking out, And so Americans in particular place a premium on that, but the Chinese have figured out how to engineer these lithium iron phosphate batteries such that the range is comparable, and they're also doing these range extenders. So instead, we used to have these cars in the U.S. that would be, mostly gas powered, but they would have a little electric part that could go 25 miles. Now you have a battery that can go 300 miles, then you have a little gas engine that can repower the battery, and maybe you can go 1,000 miles, right? So those concerns about range are diminishing, also with more charging infrastructure. Those start to go away. So if you go all in on cobalt and relations with the Democratic Republic of Congo, you may have sunk costs in a new geopolitical relationship that becomes increasingly irrelevant as battery chemistries change. And even lithium iron phosphate ones, phosphate you can get all over. I think there are more concentrations in Morocco. Those are sodium ion batteries, there's solid state batteries. And so it makes it really challenging to say lithium's probably going to be important no matter what, and so there's there's going to be demands for friendshoring and trying to make friendly relations with Australia, also countries in the Americas, but then you have like the Department of Defense taking an ownership stake in Lithium Americas, and there are going to be efforts to exploit lithium domestically in the U.S. Even if it comes at a higher cost, it means that you're not solely reliant on a pure competitor for something that you're going to need just across all different diverse battery chemistries. And so it's a challenging thing. Anyway, I was like, people would be like, I've got to go now. Anyway, I can give you a long answer for that, and that's the long answer for it. It's complex. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you for the interesting talk. I'm thinking about the LA wildfires and the insurance companies majorly exiting the market. So I'm curious about the roles of market actors, and assuming they have some eventual interest in recovering some of that market shares, do you see them playing a role? And in terms of this real estate connection to the current administration, since you mentioned none of this is going to get done without some sort of major state initiative, I want to just pick your brains on that.
I mean, the way I think about this is sort of moral hazard problems of people increasingly living in fire-prone places, and then every time their neighborhood burns down, they just get compensated to rebuild without changing behavior very much. As a consequence of that, you have market actors saying, sorry, we're done, we're out. We're not going to serve this area, because we have too often done that. And so I think they're starting to change. Like if you want to get insurance in some markets, then you have to fireproof your home, maybe in terms of materials or landscaping. But it's just become very popular for people to live in sort of forest-adjacent communities because it's pretty. But then next thing you know, if you have climate change in multi-year droughts, like you just end up with devastating fires that, and we also changed our fire regime so that, we used, you can remember, well, most of you are probably too young to remember, but it was like only you can prevent forest fires, and you had Smokey the Bear. We did a whole 50-year project to prevent forest fires. But the old way of managing fires would be like occasional burning so that you didn't have so much dry tinder develop and then they get out of control. And so there are whole societal level changes on the wildfire front that we need to make so that we don't reward things that are ultimately going to be self-defeating, which is like building property in nice forested areas without any thought to maybe it's going to burn down someday, and we need to be mindful of that and give both individual consumers and insurance companies incentives to operate there, or maybe not. And maybe we got to manage our forests differently, and maybe people can't live that close to fire-prone places.
Great. Okay, hold on. We've got David online, Eugene, Grace, and then some other hands. There was another one that just went up. Okay, that means David is up.
Josh, good evening. Just have a quick question. So
Yep.
it looks like some people might argue that renewable energy applications might be mediocre at best. If you look at recently Arizona with the solar panel foundry closing down because of efficiency levels, or even in California, there's a lot of wind turbines that they propose. You look at 29 Palms, but they're placed in disadvantageous areas because of policies like NIMBY, not my backyard. So it seems like there's a state and federal disconnect. So I'm wondering, I'm curious what you would propose the United States as a country do to support renewable energy, because I would counter that Americans actually are aware of climate change, but we are kind of restricted on the awareness of resource limitations and requirements.
Yeah.
Because your example of China, I would say that the majority of the area in the country in the West are rural. So Xinjiang, they have the ability to have these large solar panels and wind turbines, but I'm quite sure that residents in New York, they support climate change and renewable energy, but they probably would take offense if there's 50 large wind turbines in Central Park just coming out of nowhere. So I'm curious what your thoughts would be.
Yeah, I mean, so you're probably familiar with the abundance argument from Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, their book, which was basically the U.S. needs to build stuff again, right? We kind of got out of the practice, and we have, too many barriers to building things. And in their mind, it's building clean things, not building, coal-burning power plants. And so there have been recent arguments about permitting reform and the need to move in that direction. Things have been fraught politically because permitting reform for Republicans means like, let's build mines or let's build, more natural gas pipelines. And for Democrats, it's meant, building more renewables. And now we're in a moment in which the current administration is like, no wind turbines at all. Wind turbines are bad. And you're just like, we need energy. And they're, you're right about like the New York example. I mean, RFK Jr., who's now leading our Health and Human Services, like led efforts off Martha's Vineyard because he didn't want his view despoiled, right, by wind turbines offshore. And we got to get over that kind of stuff. There's a new book called Breakneck about China's ability to deploy infrastructure at scale. And the reason why they're able to do it is because it's an authoritarian regime, and also they're not excessively wedded to sort of legal prescriptions that we've had in the U.S., which have done some good stuff to protect us from bad things in the 1960s and 1970s, but now it's increasingly challenged to build anything at all. Like California has been trying to build high-speed rail for like 2 decades. And if you've been on a high-speed rail train, even not the fastest high-speed rail train, I took one from Shanghai to Hefei last year. It's like going from Indianapolis to New York, and it took 2 hours. And I think of what is that, a drive like 6 hours in the US? I was like 2 hours, we went there in the morning, we went to all these factories, we went to the Goshen battery factory, we went to a VW EV factory, and then we took the train back all in a day. And it was like we had like a week experience in 24 hours in that. And I'm like, why can't we have nice things here, right? And so there are issues associated with siting, right? Like there are, vulnerable areas that we don't want to, but there's a lot of area that is already degraded land. So there's a guy, Dustin Mulvaney at San Jose State, I'm gonna get it wrong. He's in California, and he's done a lot of work saying like, let's be judicious. Let's not, we don't have to put up a bunch of solar panels in our national parks, but there are areas that are better, and there have been maps, people have mapped it and said we can meet a lot of our energy needs by concentrating our renewable energy resources in areas that are already degraded. And we could also start to, like California's starting to cover their aqueducts, so you both, with solar panels to reduce evaporation, but also use unused space. You could do that over car parks, you could do that on malls. There are lots of ways in which we could meet a lot of our energy needs and just be a little smarter. But we gotta figure out how to build stuff again.
Right, we got somebody online?
Yes, online they ask, based on your experience writing climate change security language in the 2022 NDS and the likelihood of the new NDS, currently in draft, removing all climate change security language, what are the biggest impacts to international security environment of the U.S. removing this language? How do you think the DoD enterprise will respond to the removal of the climate change security language?
So the current Secretary Hegseth has said, we don't do climate change stuff anymore, except we're going to protect our bases from climate impacts. And so that was the bulk of the activity that was really consequential during the last several administrations, is that's where the money is, right? There's other stuff about language in the NDS, about climate change, but in terms of where the real, center of gravity in terms of resources, it was about protecting infrastructure and bases. All the other stuff was slight and probably not all that consequential in the grand scheme of things. So it's not quite clear to me that even if the NDS ceases to mention climate change, that the department won't think about, maybe some of our bases might get knocked down and we want to figure out how to harden them from hurricanes, right? So I think it's a mistake to deprioritize it because it'll probably have other consequential effects. But there's also the countervailing movement afoot, which is interesting in that the department, there have been a series of news stories, including, I mentioned Lithium Americas, there's also stock, the DoD and the US government has taken an ownership stake in MP Materials for rare earths, and there was a new one announced in Alaska. I'm going to get the name wrong. And so the DoD is trying to make investments in minerals and battery-related technologies, which could help, prepare the U.S. better in terms of building a supply chain ecosystem that would be beneficial for batteries, which have myriad uses. The current administration doesn't seem to believe in some of those other uses, but maybe there will be some provenance and luck that some of these investments to de-risk U.S. dependence on China for minerals, that a different administration, if there is one, will be able to turn some of those investments to be able to support other end uses.
Hey, Josh. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
I'll just quickly say, if you want this to be on IR syllabi, you got to develop the first part of the paper and get out most of the second part of the paper, right? The arguments about Waltz and ordering principles, you've got to develop that because the second part of the paper not that connected to the first part.
Right.
That's just a side comment.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I think you're sort of barking up maybe the wrong tree for getting international relations or international security excited about climate change.
Yeah.
And it's because you're a good guy.
Yeah.
And you want things to be happy and cooperative. You think the thing that has to happen is people have to realize that it's worth it to cooperate.
Yeah.
And I'm, of course, skeptical of that because people are mean and nasty and free ride and all of those things. So they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
But there is a different way, which is if countries are trying to adapt to climate change, right? Because they know climate change is coming. It's this factor that's outside, external to them, that's going to hurt them. As that gets more and more expensive, the thing that's making it more expensive is other countries' failure to mitigate.
Yeah.
And there are certain specific countries that fail to mitigate and emit a lot. And there are a bunch of countries that fail to mitigate and it doesn't matter because they're not big emitters.
Yeah.
But it seems like the international security rub or the international security impact will be, at what point do we get pissed off enough at the countries that are raising our adaptation costs that we're willing to reach out and touch them and say, damn it, you're mitigating now. The 82nd Airborne is coming to do your mitigation. Right? And so, like, we went to Brazil together.
Yeah.
Brazil has a problem burning down their rainforest.
Yeah.
That hurts us.
Yeah.
I'm sick of it.
Yeah.
Let's go conquer the damn rainforest.
Right.
Like, isn't that the international security story about climate change? Is not when do people get upset about other countries' mitigation efforts, but when do they get upset about other countries' lack of mitigation efforts?
I think that was an underdeveloped point, and that kind of came up earlier. I mean, Steve Walt had a piece in Foreign Policy, which is like, when is the U.S. going to invade Brazil and the Amazon? Which is kind of fanciful, but it raises the point that I was trying to make in the piece, in that the cooperation prospect, like, we're in a moment in which we're going to have to make geopolitical competition work. And I've said this in other places, maybe not so concretely here, is that we need to make geopolitical competition work for climate protection, not against it, right? And so part of that is like the blame game. Like in 2009, there was a well-known meeting in Copenhagen in which there was an effort, because the previous negotiations had failed, and so the then Obama administration sort of did an interesting play where they made it, there was an effort to mobilize like $100 billion in climate finance for developing countries. And China was seen as like the bad actor at that meeting, and that meeting failed. And the US did a lot to position the media to spin it that the Chinese were the ones responsible for those developing countries not getting their $100 billion. And they succeeded in doing that, and then that put pressure on China, so that by the time you got to the 2015 Paris Agreement, China didn't want that to happen again because they didn't want to be seen as the bad guys. And they were prepared to take some steps that were consequential for them. They're still thinking about what's in their national interest, but part of their national interest calculation was, we do not want another diplomatic gathering in which people point the finger at us. And so that was part of their reason for being solicitous in the lead up to Paris. We're in a different moment, and so it's, you have to think through a different set of strategies. But I think, I take your point that the first part that's semi-theoretical needs to connect more with the second point. And so I have to carry that through line a bit more. but I'll probably do that by thinking about the opportunities for blame. I think we could be like, we could be in a world in which the worst situation was some of the conversations that I saw at the Pentagon, which was thinking about how to fight the most environmentally responsible war, and I was like, that ain't it, guys. That's not a place where we want to be, and so. It could lead us into weird potentialities, but I appreciate the comment, inquiry. Yeah.
Okay, next we have Trevor.
So I share.
It's coming. Be there. All right.
So I share Eugene's skepticism, about international cooperation.
Yeah.
You mentioned perpetual concerns about readiness, specifically DISC operations, wildland firefighting, and international risks, particularly the Arctic.
Yeah.
Yet the response to those risks are often heavily politicized.
Yeah.
So have you seen, or do you see the opportunity for a different level of cooperation, perhaps between government and industry, free of borders, that may mitigate national security concerns?
Government and industry, yeah. I don't have obvious answers on the industry side of things, but I think we're in a moment in which the lead civilian agency that should be tasked to respond to this, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is probably going to be under capitalized and loss of human beings able to do stuff, that the next time we have something terrible happen like Helene or California or like the floods that we had this summer, like if you read the stories of like in Kerrville in Texas, the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, he does not like to have a cell phone. When he gets home, he doesn't want his kids to have a cell phone, so he went home and he locked his phone in a box. And was unavailable, and because the current secretary of DHS has to approve anything over $100,000, he had to make that request personally to her to authorize the emergency response in the 24 hours after that. And so when you have your civilian agencies that are tasked to keep people safe and help respond to domestic emergencies asleep at the switch, it's going to become the military's problem when it's not their primary core responsibility. They do not sort of plan. They're not like doing force planning to think about how many people do we need for wildfires out west. They basically, anytime something bad happens, we're just going to mobilize who we can because we are planning the force for overseas contingencies. And I think. What worries me most is that we're going to decapitate our civilian capacity to respond to natural disasters because people blame FEMA for things that are crazy, and then it'll become the military's job, and they're already overstretched and have other responsibilities, and they're doing other things at the moment that also are not their responsibility, whether it be the border or, I'm going to be plain, like fighting rebellions in Portland against guys clad in frog suits. Like, that's not what we need to be sending 82nd Airborne to do. And if it becomes the 82nd Airborne's problem, we've messed up. That's not their job. Their job, but it may increasingly be, we actually might need to plan around like National Guard. They're like, we have year-round fires now. What are we going to do? We need to figure out a strategy where, and maybe there's a role for private sector, folks in the mix there, but we got to get that civilian government federal part working better and right and have public confidence in that. And it doesn't help if our national leadership is poo-pooing them and saying they can't do stuff. They're the gang that can't shoot straight. Well, if not them, who? And we can't have a world in which the only people that can shoot straight are guys whose main job is to shoot straight, but that's not, rescuing babies in a flood is not their main job.
Hi, Professor. First of all, thank you very much for your talk. My question is a bit broader.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you think that could be ever possible for a U.S. China security concern, specifically like that lens and that form of messaging, to be a way through which the U.S. stops ignoring the structural incentives to enter the climate energy transition. So, for example, one thing I think about is critical minerals. You've seen a big push from the State Department through EXIM to engage in commercial diplomacy in Africa, SBA and DoD investment, all to increase our critical mineral capacity and access those supply chains. But it all comes through the lens of China, not climate change.
Right.
So, I'm wondering, could that ever be, and is that the only way that the U.S. could ever pivot towards actually taking action on this issue? Does it have to be China specific, or do you think it ever be something else?
That's a great question. So on some level, this whole paper is a project to rescue this set of concerns about climate and the energy transition from the environmental world. Because when it's in that world, it's politicized, but at the same time, there's a risk of over-instrumentalizing China as this adversary to be the sort of magic frame around which political actors can ally across the ideological spectrum. Because the consequence of that is extreme anti-China hysteria, which makes it harder for the U.S. to do things like China is now at the technological frontier on lithium iron phosphate batteries. U.S. doesn't know how to make them really. Ford has a licensing agreement with the Chinese battery manufacturer CATL to make them at their plant in Michigan. But we're increasingly making it politically impossible and financially impossible to take advantage of like tax incentives under the previous Inflation Reduction Act to get that intellectual property back from China that was initially invented here, right? They're able to commercialize at scale. They now know how to make stuff in China. Why can't we make it here? And why can't we, incentivize their firms to want to work with our firms to make it here? Because they need overseas markets. They have an interest in that. And so the China frame as the sort of anti can work to some extent, but we need to have more nuance, because if we cut ourselves off from the ability to learn from them, we're cooked. We need to get that intellectual property back in the U.S. and know how to make that stuff here.
Yeah, calling myself. Prerogative. So I think Eugene's entirely right that you need to focus more on the theory.
Yeah.
If that's the audience you want.
Yeah.
The question's how to do it.
Yeah.
Who's your role model?
Yeah.
And I think you can get famous if you bring a theory from one area and apply it to a new domain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's where your promise is. And the role model to me is Posen, Ethnic Conflict and the Security Dilemma. That was a really cool article. So how can you do something like that for climate? And I'm just going to spitball here, but I think also too about Lipson's article on cooperation in economics versus security, and how those two domains are different. Well, what about climate? How can you apply that kind of analysis to climate and see how climate adds different structural variables, or not necessarily structural variables? So I see concepts that might come back to life. The two-level game seems very present in your analysis.
Yeah.
You could play up that some. Verification in the domain of climate. How does that work? If you want to have international agreements, you're going to need verification. Tell me more about that, because that gets you into all the Cold War literature on transparency and arms control. And, you could really do something there. Another thing would be threat perceptions.
Right.
And there's some interesting threat perceptions going on here. One would be, are we being demonized and China's capitalizing it because we're now getting out of everything? They're not just profiting from it, but maybe they're using it politically for propaganda. I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's one perception way of looking at it. And the other is perception of the threat itself, because if we don't have a common view of the threat, we're not going to agree on anything. And people who think it's a hoax, those people are not going to move on this issue. So how is threat perception different between different countries? And so it's just a little spattering of things to think about that could get you more into that theoretical lens. I think you've got tons of great anecdotes and stuff about how climate's changing, and I was really happy. A lot of your sites are very recent.
Yeah.
So you can really see how the literature is moving very, very fast right now.
Yeah.
And so if you want to start theorizing about it, this could be a very ripe time for you to take advantage of that. So
Yeah.
that's my 2 cents.
Okay. Well, point well taken. I think the through line of the theoretical argument at the front end needs to connect more in the back half, and so I'll have to think about how best to do that. Yeah, great.
Great. I think, Grace, you had another shot, a 2-finger on your own point.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask a question related to the discussion on kind of China's role in this. I find it very interesting, and this might be a little beyond the scope of your research, but I'm wondering, just kind of theoretically, how do you think that as this crisis becomes more desperate and we're looking at these interstate negotiations, how do you think this is going to affect China's human rights situation and kind of as its perception, as like the world's perception of China changes? Because I see it going kind of one of two ways of where, like, as you have China negotiating with the U.S. and the EU, and like you were talking about the 2015 Paris Agreement, China kind of maybe making compromises because recently negotiations between China and other countries about like cooperating on the climate crisis have not been very successful because there's been disagreements in kind of integral ideas of rights and other ideological factors.
Yeah.
So do you think that, one, China will be willing to compromise and maybe address its human rights situation, address its ideological views a little bit in order to further climate negotiations? Or two, do you think that China's kind of monopoly on the infrastructure that may help solve the crisis may make China into a nation that's more positively perceived globally, like the case was where, as China was providing vaccines, for example, during the COVID pandemic to a lot of countries, countries receiving China's vaccines, their perceptions of China became more positive. So sorry, this was a long-winded question, but where do you see, do you think China's going to be willing to compromise, or do you think that it's going to be able to become more reaffirmed in its ideologies because of changing viewpoints?
I'm not convinced anybody actually cares about human rights anymore, let alone inside China. I think where they care is instrumentally using like the Uyghurs, in Washington as a means of punishing China. But I'm not clear if people actually who use like the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, that's sort of used as a wedge issue to basically try to deny Chinese companies from being able to do business in the U.S. But I don't know if any advocates there's probably some who are honest and actually care about Uyghurs, but I think others are using that instrumentally as an anti-China wedge. I think there are actors around the world who care about the implications for their citizens of Chinese foreign direct investment in their countries. So there was mining dumping, I think I made it dumpage, I just created a word. There are tailings in a Zambian river that have from mine waste, and the Zambians are upset about that. And the reason why Chinese companies may be upset about that is they could get kicked out of the country, and they could maybe have their assets nationalized or seized, or their workers could be murdered because they've befouled local waterways in Zambia. And so I think the route to China caring about human rights in the broader sense, not inside China, because that's their own sovereign concerns. I don't think they're going to be responsive to international pressure on that. But you hear about, they're more receptive to like ESG standards, environment, social governance standards, when it has to do with foreign direct investment overseas, because their companies are listed on global stock markets, and there could be reputational material consequences for them of things like this Zambian water pollution episode. So I don't think in the context of international climate negotiations that China's going to do much to say, like, you can look inside my own human rights practices inside China. I don't think they have any interest in that, but their companies are going to be responsive to international pressure, particularly if they're listed on global stock exchanges or have, joint ventures with other companies from Western markets. And so I think that's the route to have influence over them. But human rights is human rights. Given the state of the world right now, I'm like, I don't know.
With that happy note,
Yeah.
let's give them a great round of applause.
Yeah. Thank you.